There was a subtle change in the map of Eastern Europe in the 1990s. You might have noticed it, you might have missed it. Before the 1990s, if you look to Eastern Europe, east of Poland, there was a region called the Ukraine. It was a province of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It had been a province of the Russian Empire. It was the Ukraine. Through the 1990s, however, we gradually were told, don't say the Ukraine, say Ukraine. We're not a region of someone else. We're not the Midwest or the Urals. We are our own country. We are Ukraine. One of the open questions this week is whether Ukraine will stay Ukraine, or is it being brought back to the Ukraine? It seems like Vladimir Putin wants to roll back the clock. But the question is, to what year does he want to roll back the clock? Does he want to roll it back to 1988, when there was still a Soviet Union with a Black Sea fleet stationed in the Crimean Peninsula, and the Ukraine was essentially a province of Greater Russia? Or does he want to roll it back to 1968, when Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, Czechoslovakia, to crush pro-democracy sentiment and to prop up another puppet communist government? Does Putin want to roll back to 1948 and the Berlin airlift, where the nation on the western end of Soviet influence was partitioned into an east and a west, a friendly communist government and a hostile democratic government? Or does he want to turn the clock back even further to 1939, when the world was plunged into a war as Hitler demanded to reunite ethnic Germans under a greater German Reich? Existing European borders with Czechoslovakia and Austria and Poland be damned, and no pesky international law or order or United Nations to get in the way. Now, each of these possible dates backward have provided parallels to possible solutions to the current crisis, or perhaps what his goals might be, what the end game might be. Some have thought it is full annexation of Ukraine, turning it back into the Ukraine. Some have thought maybe the goal is a puppet government, one that's more friendly to Moscow, like that of Belarus. Some have speculated that perhaps a partition is in the future, to leave a rump Ukraine, a fraction of what it was, more or less centered around the town of Lviv, which used to be in eastern Poland, now in western Ukraine. Or perhaps this is the opening salvo in an ongoing military conflict in the heart of Europe that will restore the Soviet Empire and thus will draw in more and more nations into conflict. And then, of course, there is the end game of end games, which we have really not let ourselves think about for more than 30 years. A new Cold War with proxy fighting and complete with mutually assured destruction. It is still mad, of course, this nuclear deterrent, but who said geopolitics runs according to reason? Supposedly, Mark Twain said, God invented war to teach Americans geography. Now, in this case, we already knew where Ukraine was, just given recent history. In fact, we even knew how to pronounce its capital. It's no longer Kiev, it's Kyiv. That's how the Ukrainians say it. And we might have even known who the president was because of a previous impeachment trial in the recent past. In a flashback experience today, I turned on NPR and I heard Alexander Vindman on the radio being asked for analysis. Remember, the officer serving in the White House who was the whistleblower for the blackmail attempt on Ukraine. He himself was born in Ukraine to a Jewish family and emigrated to America in 1979 at age 4. And so he's fully fluent in Ukrainian, in Russian, and in English, and now he's an analyst. And I had shades of 2019 all over again with Alexander Vindman on the radio. So we knew about Ukraine, we knew about Kyiv, we knew about this country and its precarious position. Now, those familiar with Jewish history have also heard of Ukraine and many of the cities involved in the news just this past week. Ukraine was part of the Pale of Settlement under the Russian Empire, where Jews were excluded from Moscow and the Russian interior, but they were allowed to live in a certain territory that included Poland and also included Ukraine. And in Ukraine, the major cities were homes to tens of thousands of Jews. In 1939, Odessa had over 200,000 Jews living there, almost a little bit less than the number of Jews in Chicagoland today. And even after the Holocaust, as late as 1970, there were still 115,000 Jews living in Odessa. Odessa was the home of Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah. It was a birthplace of Zionism and Zionist thought. It was even the birthplace of a poet whose poetry we read tonight, from Shaul Chernikovsky, Laugh at All My Dreams. He was born and grew up in Odessa. As another example, what is now the Ukrainian Lviv, or it was the Polish Lvov, was in the Pale of Settlement period not part of the Pale of Settlement at all. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was called Lemberg. But that also had as many as 200,000 Jews living there in 1939, a major center for industry. Before the 20th century, Ukraine was the home to major centers of Hasidic Jewish thought. And to this day, Uman, which is the burial place of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, and Mezhibizh, which is where one finds the grave of the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, they are both sites of regular and massive ultra-Orthodox pilgrimage. Obviously not this year, but in previous years, it has been overwhelming. The desire to go back to that homeland to see the graves of these sainted figures. And even before Ukraine was taken over by the Russian Empire, it was part of the Polish-Lithuanian monarchy for centuries, until a Cossack rebellion in 1648 led to some kind of Ukrainian independence for about a century. Now, that revolution to create Ukrainian independence in 1648 was seen as a disaster by the Jews, because they had been the agents, the emissaries of the Polish landowners, and they were attacked by the Cossacks. And the hero of that revolution, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, is a great villain in Jewish history, but he's a national hero to the Ukrainian story. In fact, when the Crimean Peninsula was taken over and parts of the Ukrainian Navy were confiscated by the Russians, one of the ships they took was the SS Khmelnytsky. And I heard this story, I thought, the SS Hitler, what? I mean, Khmelnytsky is terrible. Why would you name a ship after him? But for them, he's a national hero. You see, this highlights the complexity of Jewish connections to Ukraine. We have a long history there, but there's also a long history of suffering there, pogroms and anti-Semitism. There was tremendous Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis during the Holocaust. For example, outside of Kyiv, there was a massacre of over 30,000 Jews in 2 days at a ravine called Babi Yar, and there's still a memorial there that one can see. And of course, ongoing tension even after the Second World War. And yet, even today, Ukraine is home to over 100,000 Jews, many of whom are elderly. In fact, I just spoke with a family today who are from Kharkiv, which you've again seen in the news, and they still have family living there. They still have friends living there they went to elementary and middle and high school with. They're still in touch with that place. It's still actively a part of Jewish life. And don't forget, of course, we know that President Zelensky himself is Jewish, which is what made Putin's denazification claim either more ridiculous or more ominous. Now, I am not a scholar of Eastern Europe. I am not a prophet. I do not even play a pundit on cable TV. I do not know what will happen. I don't even know if there will still be any independent Ukraine even 1 week from today. I just checked my internet and news during a break in our service tonight to make sure there was still a Ukraine to talk about. And there are more explosions in Kyiv. There's an incursion into the city, and we don't know what the future will bring. My job is Jewish history and identity and applying humanistic psychology and philosophy for a better living. That's what I do. And so I have 3 psychological or philosophical questions, and then we'll have an open discussion on what's happening now. The first, why does this crisis feel scarier than others? We've had a first world power at war at different parts of the world recently. After all, don't forget the United States was in Afghanistan until about 15 minutes ago. We know that there has been active and intense Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. In fact, most of the army veterans in the Russian army today have served time in Syria and have fought there over the last 7 years. Are we more afraid because this is happening in Europe, which we think of as civilized? Are we more concerned because these are white people fighting each other instead of white versus brown? Are we more concerned because now we have two first world countries, or at least first and a second world country? These are real powers with smartphones and the internet. You know, we're seeing TikTok, we're seeing tweets all the time of what's happening. This is not the first world versus the third world, like in Syria, like in Afghanistan, or in Pakistan. Perhaps this is scary because if this could happen between two European countries, this could happen anywhere. Or maybe we're afraid because a war like this in one place doesn't tend to stay in one place. Already there are noises being made by Finland and Sweden who might be interested in joining NATO, and counter threats by the Russians: don't you dare even look at NATO, or we might invade you too. Cyber warfare knows no boundaries and no borders. And you might have heard the news that Putin decided to have a parade today of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, around Moscow. Now, he wasn't deploying them any more than the last few times he's paraded them around, but he wanted to make sure he got some news coverage along the way and made everyone else nervous. Maybe it's just the case that the conflict between authoritarianism and democracy is ready for another round. It's been almost a century after all, and hopefully we have enough on the right side of history this time as well. A second large question. This is based on another aphorism attributed to Mark Twain. Supposedly, he said, "History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes." Just last week, I was talking with a couple of friends, and I was describing those eastern provinces in Ukraine that Putin was claiming to be independent territories as another example of the Sudetenland. For those who know their Second World War history, the Sudetenland was a region of Czechoslovakia that bordered Germany and had a lot of ethnic Germans. And Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be given to him. Neville Chamberlain said that the Sudeten Germans were a people in a far-off country of whom we know nothing, and he decided it was not worth going to war over them. And so he went to Munich and he gave them up. And ultimately, of course, the rest of Czechoslovakia was occupied in short order, even though Hitler claimed he only wanted the Sudetenland. And so Putin saying, "Oh, I only want the Russian parts of these territories. Oh, I only want these territories to be independent." It's the Sudetenland pattern all over again. Look back at what happened in Georgia in 2008. There were two provinces that declared independence from Georgia with a lot of Russian meddling. Ultimately, the Russians invaded Georgia, and when they pulled back, those two provinces were no longer part of Georgia. In fact, the Russians in those provinces ethnically cleansed the Georgians and pushed them out. And then they were recognized by Russia. Or what happened in Crimea in 2014, where the Russian army came in and then they held a referendum, which 95% of the people voted they wanted to become part of Russia. And again, it was a farce. These were early steps to Russian expansion. These were the steps along the way, now that we see what happened. And now the bill has to be paid. I saw a poster that was shared online today. It said, "Dear Putin, let's speed this up to the part where you kill yourself in a bunker." But I don't know that history will indeed rhyme this time. It could spiral in very different directions. Remember that in 1939, the Poles were attacked by the Germans on September 1st. They were attacked by the Soviets on September 17th, and they didn't surrender, even though it was a blitzkrieg with airplanes and mechanized infantry. They fought back for 26 days, and it included a brutal bombing of Warsaw that killed over 6,000 people at the time. So the fact that the Ukrainians have not lost in the first 3 days doesn't mean this isn't rhyming with history. The stock market was up today, if you happen to notice. Some of the articles said that this is from optimism. People saw that Ukraine was reaching out and they were planning to have diplomatic talks with Russia. Of course, the talks were supposed to be hosted in Minsk in Belarus. And if I were a Ukrainian, I would not go anywhere near Belarus because they allowed the Russian tanks to go through there. But I'm more cynical. I think the market was up today because investors expect the war to be over soon. They expect the sanctions not to last, that the Europeans and the Americans will lose their nerve or lose their willingness to deal with the pain caused by Russia cutting off gas and oil supplies. And they expect business to get back to usual, more or less, in the near future. I'm more cynical on that question. So we don't know if history will rhyme or if it will be very different. But so far, the parallels are disturbing. And the third question, what could have been done and what can be done now? As a parallel to this, consider different philosophies of ethics. People have been trying for a long time to figure out how to get everyone to do the right thing. And there are a couple different approaches. One approach is you could try to understand their motivations and address any legitimate grievances and then reason with them. We might not have realized how much NATO expansion into Eastern Europe was considered threatening by Russia. And expanding a democracy is threatening to dictators like Putin. Now, it would be hard for NATO to turn down countries that really do want to join. And it would be very hard for countries that value freedom to tell other people to submit to dictatorships, like in Belarus, rather than pursue self-determination and freedom. But this attack did not come from nowhere. And we may have made mistakes that contributed to this terrible action, even if ultimately it is Putin's sin and Putin's crime. You can try to get people to behave better by talking about their reputation, by appealing to their sense of decency, or by making philosophical arguments about duty and righteousness and international law. Obviously, that failed here. But there are parallels to this in history and even in literature. There's a famous scene in the Torah where God is determined to destroy the Israelites. They've committed a great sin of building a golden calf and worshiping it in place of Yahweh. And so he says to Moses, Moses, you see what your people have done? I'm going to wipe them out. And Moses is the master psychologist who knows just what to say to calm down God and to get him to move forward. So first he reminds God they're your people too, like parents arguing what your child has done. Well, same thing happening in this story. And then he does exactly those things. He talks about God's reputation. If you do this, people will think you weren't strong enough to make it all the way into the promised land. He appeals to a sense of loyalty and decency. You promised by your own name, you loved their ancestors, and you promised them that you would raise a mighty nation out of them. He tries the same strategies. In the Torah's case, it works. But in Putin's case, it did not. Another way to get people to behave well, you can threaten consequences. Basic consequentialist ethics. Do something wrong, receive a punishment. But those consequences had better be proportional and direct and effective and immediate. Telling someone, I'll punish you in a way that will gradually affect your finances in 2 to 4 months, that would not deter a teenager, let alone a dictator. This is why I sometimes call the traditional religious reward and punishment in an afterlife with a heaven and hell where God is keeping score, but you don't find out what the score is until you die and then you receive your judgment, it's kind of a wimpy theology, not wimpy as in weak, but wimpy as in Popeye. You know what Wimpy says? I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Well, if you're going to be paid back in the distant future for whatever you do now, is that really going to deter you from acting when you see immediate benefit and the consequences are maybe in the future? Well, it's not going to work. Now, sometimes if you want to enforce consequences for bad behavior, it's going to punish you too. Any parent who has had the experience of giving their child a timeout knows that the timeout can be hard on the parent because they have to listen to their kid be upset and not intervene. Or sometimes the punishment requires you to supervise the enactment of the punishment. But your willingness to accept the inconvenience, your willingness to deal with your own pain or consequence of enforcing a consequence on someone else shows how important the issue is and the point you're trying to make. In this case with Putin, I don't know that larger sanctions or earlier sanctions would have made a difference, to be honest. But what was done clearly did not work. It was not immediate enough. It was not direct enough. And to be honest, we didn't show that we were willing to put up with the pain that would be caused by more serious consequences. And sometimes, when people are committed to doing wrong, it takes the force of many people to stop them. It takes a social consensus, a commitment to collective action, and maybe more. There's a phrase in the Torah that says, do not stand idly by while your neighbor is doing wrong. You must intervene. You cannot wait. And there are all kinds of laws, volumes and volumes of rabbinic law about setting up court systems and systems for enforcing these laws because they do not enforce themselves. We've been hopeful that the international order will enforce itself, but it simply has not happened in this case, and so now we need to try something else. I recently listened to a podcast of a mass open online class by a Yale professor named Donald Kagan about the ancient Greek polis and the history of diplomacy and war between Athens and Sparta, and Athens and the Persian Empire, and Sparta, the Persian Empire, and all the other polis that were around them. Some of the human truths that were true then are still human truths today, with all of our advanced weaponry and computing power. When we face an adversary, we need to assess their intentions and choose our actions carefully. It's a dilemma. If we prepare for war when they really mean peace, then they may become belligerent and start a conflict unnecessarily. But if we insist on responding to any and all provocations with accommodation, we may find ourselves in a progressively worse position to face the ultimate conflict. In the book of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible, we read, there is a time to laugh and a time to weep, a time of war and a time of peace. In our day today, only time will tell what time this is, today and tomorrow.